I found something that I shouldn't have seen, and now I fear it's only a matter of time before it erupts from me. There is a hiking trail in the Appalachian Mountains leading to some overgrown fields left forgotten for decades at a time. I was out there, alone, in my naivety, exploring the great green outdoors upstate of New York. Fascinated by the diversity of the wild and plant life in such a wide area, unpolluted by civilization. I was picking some mushrooms alongside the bank of a river when I spotted it. An old farmstead was up a hill, covered by some unusually tall bushes and vines that seemed to hold on it, camouflaging it, embracing it to return to nature, to cease to exist. Picking the best mushrooms I deemed edible for lunch, the old abandoned farmstead garnered much of my attention and indeed my curiosity. Despite the small section of my mind telling me to go my way, I ignored it and walked towards those doors, enchanted by the idea of how a farmstead can exist in such a rural location. I checked the surroundings around the farm. There were no dirt roads leading back to civilization, nor were there any signs of modern machinery or cars that would have graced the ancient farmstead. I then walked towards the dilapidated front door. Its age was showing through the cracks in the white lead paint. I chipped some of the paint away, a very telling sign of just how unmaintained the property had been. Pulling the handle, the door made a loud squeak. If there had been a person inside, they surely would have heard it. I waited a couple of moments, waiting to see movement or any sort signs of life. Nothing. I moved in and investigated the somewhat dark living room, only lit by the sun outside. The coffee table was on its side as if it was thrown across the room. The couches had been torn with the cushion filling all over the couch. Whatever had transpired here, it was clear there was a struggle. I then inspected the walls and saw a five-pointed star inside a circle made of ash. A clear inverted pentagram with a horned goat was present within it. A sigil. And that is when I lost consciousness. All I remember was going down, feeling so tired. I could not fight the tiredness that I felt during it all. It was my obligation to lose consciousness for whatever was inside that farm. I woke up in an unfamiliar room, the basement. All six sides of the room were full of its sigils made of fresh blood with wax candles lit around the four corners of the room. The sigils were all intricately connected, the blood flowing and moving as if it were in its natural environment. I felt a burning pain from my body. Lowering my eyes, that's when I saw cuts of my wrists widening with my blood flowing to the sigils, sucking me dry of my vitality and life, powering this wretched farmhouse of whatever was contained within. The wax candles increased in brightness as more of my blood flowed through the sigils. I screamed in anguish and cried. I suddenly felt a primal urge to express my pain and let out the rage. I crept towards the door, my conditioning worsening by the minute. I knew I had to get out before I lost consciousness again. My mind was bombarded with contradicting emotions that mentally confused me. Sadness, anger, jealousy, happiness, euphoria, and even pleasure. I could not focus on the task I was trying to achieve. Each step made it harder and harder to leave the room. However, deep down, I knew each step was a step closer to freedom. Each step was a memory of emotional intrigue. Each memory was blurry except for the emotions I could clearly feel. Anger from the time I squandered with my opportunities, and happiness from the times I've been with the people I love. I eventually found myself in the living room once again. The sun had gone down. The living room is now lit by the moonlight. My eyes gradually adjusted, allowing me to see within the dark. I touched the sigil made of ash. I felt the suffering and pain that had gone into making it exist in this world. I tried to rub it out, rub through the pain. It could not be rubbed out. No amount of strength could rub through the pain. I walked out the door and towards the wilderness. I smelled the fresh air, trying to enjoy my freedom. It didn't feel the same. I looked back towards the farmhouse, vowing to never return this path. I made it home safely. There were no creatures trying to kill me. There was nobody stalking me. And yet, deep down inside me, it felt like I'd never truly left that wretched farmhouse. Deep down inside me, something is forming. And I know it isn't natural. As I lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling only grew stronger. I slowly sat up, looking around my dark room. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but I could still feel eyes on me. I decided to get up and turn on the light, hoping that would dispel the eerie feeling. As I reached for the light switch, I heard a faint whisper in my ear.
Don't turn on the light.
It hissed.
You don't want to see what's in here with you.
My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitated, my hands trembling above the switch. Part of me wanted to turn on the light and face whatever was lurking in the darkness, but another part of me was terrified of what I might find. I took a deep breath and mustered up all my courage. I flicked the light on. And to my horror, I saw the figure from my nightmares standing in the corner of the room. It was tall and thin, with pale skin and dark, empty eyes. It stared at me with a wicked grin, its elongated fingers twitching with anticipation. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. I was frozen with fear, unable to move or speak. The figure began to move towards me, its footsteps echoing in the silence of the room. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the worst. But instead of feeling the creature's touch, I heard a loud crash and felt a gust of wind. I opened my eyes and saw that the window had been shattered and the figure was gone. I didn't know how it had escaped or why it had chosen to spare me. All I knew was that I needed to get out of that room immediately. I grabbed my things and ran out of the house, not stopping until I reached the safety of my friend's house. As soon as I arrived at my friend's house, I called the police and told them what had happened. They came to my house and searched it, but they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. They even checked the window, but there was no sign of the broken glass or the figure that had escaped through it. They told me it was safe to return to my house, but I was still too scared to stay there. I decided to stay with my friend for a few more days, until I felt ready to go back. When I finally returned to my house, I was nervous but determined to face my fears. I went to bed, determined to get a good night's sleep, but as I lay there, trying to drift off, I felt a similar feeling of being watched. I opened my eyes and saw the figure standing at the foot of my bed, its dark eyes fixated on me.
You can't escape me.
It whispered. I tried to scream, but once again no sound escaped my lips. The figure reached out and touched my face, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. As I lay there, paralyzed with fear, I realized that the figure was not just some random monster. It was a manifestation of my own fears and anxieties, brought to life by my own mind. No matter where I go, it will always be there with me. No matter how fast I run, it will always catch up. I cannot escape from it. We found out about this terrifying tale once Nanny Belle passed away and we were cleaning out her attic. Even her own daughter, my mother, didn't even know about this story or the existence of Nana Belle's diary. It was found under a loose floorboard under a heap of old suitcases. It was decaying with age, but the writing was still legible after being underground for over 50 years. The last entry was dated in July 1959, only a few months before my mother was born. According to my grandmother's diary entries, she didn't tell this story to anyone because it was so utterly frightening. In her mind, she didn't want to give this recollection any more credence than it deserved, nor did she want to frighten anyone the way it frightened her. Also, Nana Belle thought she was losing her mind and she knew she would be sanctioned in an asylum and given electric shock therapy for madness, which happened to her mother's sister after she got the blues. So the only outlet Nana Belle had was this diary. Nana Belle was born in 1940, and these encounters took place in 1975, when she was 17 years old. The first ever entry detailed what my Nana Belle described as the Harbinger. My sisters and brother compiled all of the diary entries to make into a cohesive story that I'm going to share with you. Nana Belle's ordeal is horrifying, disturbing, and unbelievable. We still struggle with the effect it has had on everyone, especially my mother. It also explains Nana Belle's emotional coldness and distance we all experienced, and even at her death at 82, she remained just as aloof and closed off as my mother remembered as a child. Was it because of this? We knew she loved us in her own way, but she lacked any maternal connection with any of us, and didn't have much in the way of compassion or empathy that we always failed to grasp. This diary held a lot of answers for us. This is Nana Belle's story. I hope we did her justice. The first time it happened, I was waiting for the bus after I finished work. I was a typist at the time, working for an accountant and doing very long hours. I was tired and cold. It had been a long day. At first when I saw it, I thought I was hallucinating. This woman was hovering above the ground across the road from me in a long black flowing cape. She was just openly staring at me. Her feet weren't even on the ground. I rubbed my eyes furiously, thinking it would go away, but it still remained there. This woman didn't even look like a typical woman, not just because she seemed to be levitating or her bizarre clothing, but she didn't even look, well, human. The woman's head looked dome-shaped, framed with jet black hair. She had eyes that looked like the pits of a dark, cold cave. Her mouth very small, her nose far too pointy, her hands large and nails really long. It was like a person who used a very bad template and this was the final result. I don't even know how to compute this into words. I mean, it sounds crazy, doesn't it? Imagine if I told father and mother I saw someone floating in midair wearing a cape and looking otherworldly. I would just be sent to one of those sanatoriums that my aunt got sent to, and she was never the same again. Just the thought of it makes me shiver involuntarily. The woman remained where she was, hovering, until I got on the bus and it sped off. I could feel her eyes following me until she was out of sight. When I got home, I was greeted by my mother, sobbing uncontrollably, telling me father had been killed in a work accident. The caped woman appeared again. This time she was in a cemetery where I was laying flowers on my father's grave. At first I was too shocked to be scared and just yelled "go away" at the top of my lungs. But as the woman hovered closer, I started to clamber back, utterly terrified. She opened her mouth to reveal these tiny sharp little teeth that looked like it belonged to a rodent. I tried to scream, but only a stifled yell came out. The woman began to cackle. It was a horrible, inhuman sound that penetrated into the depth of my soul. I didn't know if I wanted to block out the sound or the sight. Just as she appeared, the woman vanished. I ran home sobbing. I wanted to confide in my mother, but the implications were just as scary as my experiences. It would terrify my mom and anyone else if I confided in. When I got to the house, there were flashing lights everywhere. My mother was white-faced and talking to officers. My brother had apparently drowned in the lake at college. I haven't posted for a few months as mother and I dealt with the grief of losing both father and Eddie. I wanted to tell mother the truth about what was happening, but I couldn't find the words. How could I say that seeing this woman was a bad omen? Both times I saw her, father and Eddie were dead. Was it just a coincidence? But then, who was she? What was she? Did I have a mental illness that was making me see things? Was this all in my head? A year has passed since I saw the woman, and I have been made secretary at work. Mother is mostly okay, but it has still been really hard without father and Eddie. I'm stepping out with a man called Peter, and I think he was the one. I am so excited to eventually settle down and get married, but mother thinks I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm only 18, so I have plenty of time to save money for a wedding and a house deposit. I'm so relieved that seeing that woman was a temporary insanity that I could put behind me. She's back again. My hands are shaking as I write this. I feel sick. Why is this nightmare happening again? I was out for dinner with Peter, and through the restaurant window, I saw her standing there, looking in the glass. Her black eyes went right through me. I jumped up so abruptly that Peter leapt with fright. Diners and staff were staring with open curiosity. I composed myself and dared to look back at the window. The woman was gone. I sat down again, red with embarrassment and apologies. Peter looked at me with concern, and I explained I just got a shiver and nothing to worry about. But I felt cold with horror and sick with dread. I knew something bad was going to happen, or had already happened. A few weeks later, I received a letter from my cousin Martha. She told me Ada, our cousin, had died in childbirth a fortnight ago due to complications, and so had a baby. I've been avoiding writing about these occurrences for a while, because what if I'm giving it power by writing about this woman? This may sound ludicrous to anyone else, but to me, nothing makes any sense anymore. I've lost all reason and rationale. I feel like I'm making these bad things happen by seeing this woman. Maybe I need to remove myself from all the people I love and care about, to keep them safe and help me regain my life by not seeing this wretched specter again. I could call off my engagement to Peter, even if it broke both our hearts. Go traveling far away and not develop any close relationships with anyone ever again. But I couldn't. No matter how dire this gets, I can't leave Mother. Even if I could leave Peter, I'm all she has. I will lead as much as a normal life as I can, but keep some sort of barrier up to protect those precious to me. The woman came to me again. She was even uglier and grotesque as she was before. I didn't even realize this, but the woman had claws. I don't think the sight of her could be any more horrific, but it is. I covered my eyes when she came to me at work and pretended she wasn't there. The office assistant was looking at me, baffled when I hid my head behind the desk, trying to use the typewriter without looking at the keys. I was crying in dismay. I kept saying, "Go away," as a mantra in my head, over and over. And when I looked up, she had gone. The office assistant asked me if I was alright, and looking at me as if I was bonkers. On the way home, an ambulance sped past and I knew that someone I cared about had died. There was no doubt. I got home and saw the ambulance parked outside. I didn't even have to ask the sympathetic paramedic. I just knew Mother had died. Heart attack, they reckoned. She wouldn't have felt anything. 1 minute she was hanging up the washing, the next she was gone. Mother was only 40. How could it have been a heart attack? I refused an autopsy and sorted out all the insurance paperwork. The funeral preparations and will were already sorted. Months after I buried Mother, I sold up the family home and moved in with Peter. A few months later, we got engaged. It's 1959 now, and I'm married. I saw the woman a few more times after Mother. My grandpa died within days after my mother's sudden death. Grandpa couldn't handle the grief of losing his only child and was found dead in his bed by his housekeeper. Then Martha, my other cousin, died of tuberculosis, leaving behind her husband and 3 children. The woman appeared just as ominously as before, and by now I had become so resigned to it that I just ignored her as if she was a bothersome fly, rather than something I would be bothered by. But then, it became much worse. Peter was away on a business call, and I was in bed, asleep, when I was woken up by the most rancid breath on my face. I felt myself recoil in disgust and felt my eyes open and then widen at the sight of the woman smiling at me from next to me in bed. I screamed and jumped back so far to the other side of the bed that I fell off and landed with a painful thud on the floor. I could hear this hideous creature cackling hideously from the other side of the bed. I stayed on the ground and slid into the gap under my bed, anything to avoid this thing. Then, almost involuntarily, my eyes made contact with the woman's legs hovering above the ground and saw that her feet were hooves. Then, like every other time, this woman vanished into thin air. Only, this time it felt different. Almost as if it was final. I knew this woman wouldn't come again. When I got a telephone call to say Peter had died in a car accident, I screamed and cried and begged for him back. I was having a baby. She needed a father. I needed Peter. I wanted to rant and rave and bargain to bring him back. I would have done anything. I felt like I'd grieved enough for the whole world and shed enough tears to fill all the oceans. Yet, I still felt indescribable pain. And I still cried a million more tears. I never felt so miserable and alone. I know that in time I will feel relief that this woman is gone. I feel like I have certainty this will soon be in the past, even though I will always carry it with me. Soon I will have a child, and she will soon have her own children. What if they have the burden of this? But the fear of her return will always remain till my dying day. I know whatever she wasn't done with me, even if she didn't return. Maybe her final appearance will be at my own death or beyond. I call this woman the Harbinger. A few years ago, I decided to go to my aunt's house to see her. You see, she was getting old, very old, and we had received news from her that she was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer and had a little less than a year to live. So I quickly called her and she invited me to come and stay for a night. Of course I accepted. A few days later I packed my bags and drove the hour and a half to her house. I unloaded my bags and sat on her sofa. We talked for hours about anything and everything, from life and school to boyfriends. I always forgot she called me her blue-eyed baby boy, and my heart sank a little each time she called me that, because she wouldn't live to call me that again. Just as I was caught up in the thought, she cleared her throat and said, "Oh baby, please remind to read the note I left on your bedside table. It's important if you're going to stay the night." I said I would, and we resumed our conversation. A few hours passed before we both headed to bed. She reminded me to read the list on my bedside table. I brushed my teeth, changed into my pajamas and went to sleep, forgetting to read the note. I woke up in the middle of the night. I could hear a faint tapping coming from the window opposite of me. I froze. Shit, I forgot to read my aunt's note. I reached out for it, keeping my eyes on the window. The note read, "Dear, my blue-eyed baby boy, by the time you are reading this, we have said good night. It is too late to help me. I am dead. To ensure your safety while staying here, I have compiled a list of rules for you to follow. 1. Do not go downstairs from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. 2. If you need the bathroom, please go in the bedpan underneath your bed. 3. If you wake up during the night, eyes shut and go to sleep. 4. If you awake to a scratching, tapping, or knocking, do not respond. It will know. 5. If it enters your room, pretend you're asleep. 6. Do not call out during the night. 7. Stay silent, even if I seem to be calling you. As I've said, I am dead. 8. Just wait till the morning. 9. Remember that I love you." My blood froze. I did as the letter said. I shut my eyes tightly and stayed silent. The knocking grew louder, louder and louder, until it stopped. My heart was racing. Baby, get up, it's time for breakfast. I heard my aunt call from downstairs. Fuck, was the note a joke? If so, it was fucking cruel. My aunt called a few more times. Each time she seemed to be closer. That's when I heard my bedroom door open. It was a slow open, like the type in a horror movie. Footsteps moved through the room. Something sat on my bed. I didn't even dare to move the tip of my pinky finger. I felt it get up from my bed and shuffle out of my room. I didn't move. What felt like hours passed. I saw the sun beam through the curtains. Was it 7 a.m. yet? I carefully peered at my watch. 6:59. I breathed a sigh of relief. I watched it, waiting for 7 a.m. to tick around. It felt like an eternity. It didn't tick. Shit. Was my watch broken? Fuck. Couldn't risk it. I'll just lay here. Even if I slowly and carefully write this, trying not to move too obviously, it's still 6:59. Still fucking 6:59. I can hear it calling me now. I'm not sure how long I can stay like this. I just want to move. My legs are like fucking rods that rested in the icy night. Whatever is downstairs is not my aunt. Save me. The staring. As I sit here, thinking of the abomination that had stared back at me, I begin to think of the day it all began. It started out as any other normal day would have, and how I wish it stayed that way. I woke up late for work again. I decided to go ahead and continue my morning routine of going to the store, getting an energy drink, and checking the mail. I sat down at my computer, as I was working from home, but I couldn't bring myself to even start. Something was off. I was numb. I went day in and day out doing the same things. My team and I would sit in calls complaining about the direction our company was headed, knowing damn well that we had no control over it, no matter how much we could prove we were right. I decided to take a few extra minutes to go grab a quick bite to eat, but when I stepped outside and approached my car, it happened. The sky turned a mysterious shade of green, and a mysterious rumbling began. Not like an earthquake or the sound of a train going by, but a genuine disturbance in the atmosphere around me. I could feel the air rumbling. As I stared at the sky, a crack began to appear as if from some plane of existence beyond our own. The open air had physical cracks in it. I distinctly remember the pit of my stomach feeling like it was trying to fall out of the back end of me. Then it appeared. The cracks began to widen and an eye appeared. In case you've somehow not seen it yet, let me describe it for you. It appeared in the sky, 3 times larger than the sun, but clearly in the uppermost levels of the atmosphere, or beyond, as it was shrouded by the atmosphere separating it from me. Its iris was a toxic shade of green, and it had a pupil not unlike a goat. You know that flat rounded line. What would typically be the white of the eye was so bloodshot in appearance that one would assume it was naturally red in color. Ironically, the thing that stood out to me the most, as the most unsettling feature, was in fact that it never blinked. I never once saw it blink. What came next was the thing of nightmares. People. Panic. It's a powerful thing that can never be underestimated in its ability to create monsters of men. Before we get ahead of ourselves, let me tell you how quickly society descended into madness. As I stood there, staring at this monstrosity that almost appeared as though it was focused on me, I called my parents. "Hey Mom, have you stepped outside today?" I asked. And my mom replied, "Honey, of course I've seen it. It's all over the news." After making sure they weren't in a state of utter panic, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I proceeded to drive into town. To put this in perspective, I live in a small town of only 350 people. However, there is a larger town only 7 miles north of me. As I began to leave, I noticed things were quiet in my neck of the woods. People were all outside, gazing into the eye, the same as I was. But honestly, I was still hungry. I went to the local dollar store and it was empty. In hindsight, I assume whoever was working probably left to be with their loved ones. So yes, I stole a protein bar, another energy drink, and a bag of chips. I don't think it mattered at that point. Well, curiosity got the better of me, and that brings us to the chaos of man. I drove to the previously mentioned larger town, and it was like the apocalypse had already happened. There were buildings on fire, bodies beside the street, looting, the works. Keep in mind, all that I had done to this point was appear, nothing else. After seeing more than enough of the downfall of society, I turned around to head home. That's when I got a first-person taste of how awful people can be when they panic. As I exited from the highway to hit the overpass and exit southbound, I saw a car on the side of the road with a somber-looking man sitting next to it. I rolled my window down and asked if he was okay. He stood up and began walking towards my car. His eyes, I'll never forget. His eyes were more terrifying than the looming monstrosity above. By the time I had noticed and decided to act, it was too late. He got to the window and proceeded to reach inside and grab me by the throat. Out of sheer panic, I slammed the gas, but he didn't relent. He just screamed, "Nothing is okay. The world is doomed." Eventually, his grasp slipped and he hit the pavement. I don't know if he survived, but considering I was going 45 miles per hour by the time he loosened his grip, I'd assume he didn't. I got home and frantically flipped on the news to discover my small neck of the woods had nothing on what was going on a global scale. Death tolls were already estimated to be in the millions. Between the killings, the suicides, and the accidents caused in the panic, humanity was falling apart. There were places that hadn't even seen it yet because it never left its spot in the sky, right above me, staring at me. That didn't stop people from losing their collective minds. Some claimed it was God coming to take us home. Others claimed it was the outer gods of Lovecraftian lore. I didn't know what it was. All I know is that the numbness never subsided, almost as if my brain was fried at the lack of comprehension of what was happening. Then, the strangest thing happened. Nightfall. As the sun began to set, I stared, unrelenting at the eye. How could I not? It was staring right at me. The longer I looked, the more uneasy I felt. Once the sun finally went down, you could still see the eye, although it was just a round black silhouette with jet black cracks protruding from it, blocking the stars and the moon. Just a solid black disk in the sky. I did my best to fall asleep, but it simply wasn't going to happen. Instead, I lay awake in my bed, and that was when my mind began to rationalize what was happening. Why was I unusually calm given the circumstances? Why was it directly above me? Why was it staring at me? And lastly, why did it never blink? All of a sudden, a shift in the air happened, a noticeable change in the atmosphere, almost as if the weight was lifted. I looked at the clock, and it read 8:34 a.m. Had I really been awake all night? I stepped outside to notice the sky was still green, but the eye had vanished. At that point, only two thoughts crossed my mind. The first was obviously, where the hell did it go? The second, I'm ashamed to admit, was, shit, I should have gotten a picture. I guess I could have at least proven it was staring at me. But alas, that ship has sailed. I flipped over to the news to discover the world was in absolute shambles. I guess living in a tiny area like mine has its advantages. I drove to my parents' place to check on my mom and dad to make sure they were still okay. My phone was dead, so I couldn't call. Luckily, the worst of it was for them just being shaken up by the whole ordeal, but they'll live. It's been 6 months to the day since the eye came and went. Life has changed drastically. Power grids took a lot of damage, ironically from people. Again, the eye never moved. There were some residual issues after the eye disappeared. The day the eye vanished, cell phone towers, the internet, everything went down. We still haven't gotten that back yet. People have begun to adapt and adjust. The wounds are still here, the scars will never fully heal. However, it would seem that in the end, humanity was its own greatest enemy in this whole ordeal. I don't know what became of the eye, but as I have been telling this story, I can feel the air get heavy and uneasy, almost as if I can feel a rumble. I died and went to hell. There is a frightening, crystallized consistency in the details relayed by people resuscitated from death surrounding the psionic experience of hell. It's dark. There are no walls, no floors, no ceilings. Filled with the echoing baying of demons. Ripped at, clawed, torn, and pulled down to a bottomless interdimensional chasm. The following is a transcription recorded by me from an anonymous source. This person and I were both in the tumult of heroin addiction when this occurred. We typically used together, but this one was a rare instance of so many hundreds of benders that I wasn't at his side with the saving grace shot of Narcan. The following is an unembellished, if prosaic recollection of what he saw inside the flatlined undercurrent of death. He was under for just over 2 minutes. Remember when the red dragon bags hit? Yeah, the bad patch pits refused to sell because they were straight laced with fentanyl. Got it from Bree. Shit was fire. Deadly, but fire. I can't say I woke up. I was already there when it appeared. It just was, if you know what I mean. Or maybe you don't. It's hard to describe an awakening that's devoid of actually waking. I was on a gurney inside of my hospital room in intensive care. Only all the medical equipment was gone. It was just a dim, gloomy room with 4 walls, a grey floor and structureless ceiling, compromised of some smoky grey nimbus. There was light, but the source didn't exist. I wasn't strapped down, but I couldn't move. The quietude was reposeful and dreadful in equal measure. The gurney started to roll on its own, out of the door, into the hallway. The hallway was pitch and there was a small scampering noise all around. Shit, I'd never been so fucking afraid. It smelled like a hospital. The aroma of bleach and formaldehyde, which was acrid and almost nauseating. I know too well the scent of the latter because I used to work for my uncle who was an undertaker. I'd seen lots of death in all sizes and shapes. At some point a figure appeared in front of me, nude, crystalline white, almost the lustrous consistency of selenite quartz. Its skin glittered under the sourceless light. It was hairless and had deep, sunken cheeks. The walls were some sort of grey colored material, and the ceiling was missing. It was dark but cloudy. Tacked to the corridor walls were unlit candles inside of black, gothic designed holders. Bizarre as this new reality was, it actually felt, as best as I can articulate, cathartic, like I'd reached the end of my means and was at a place of serenity. Then the rope figured and the walls materialized. Both the nefarious creature and the one in the religious habit were pulling me towards something. Then it started to rain. As I was being pulled along, there was a momentous break in the fold which absolutely dumbfounded me. I suddenly found myself sitting Indian style in black grass next to Bethany Sykes, a girl I was close with in my adolescence who died when we were in fourth grade. She fell out of the window, and her head was sundered down the center with blood that deluged from the tear coursing down her back ceaselessly. She was sobbing into her palms, and then she spoke. I wish you weren't here. You can't be here. You don't know what this all is. What is? They won't allow me to. What? Oh, I can hear it. Can you? Where are we? Why are you here? Shouldn't you be in heaven? God, I wish you knew, she said, seeming harried. Then she told me she was afraid for me, followed by a bizarre inquiry. Is it purple yet? It thundered, but the thunder was a droning mutter, a deep, menacing laugh. Her face went dark, and I was siphoned back to unreality. A silent voice told me something I could only feel with my soul. It said that Bethany was an outgrowth of evil, that her harlot of a mother had an abortion before she was born, and thus, in the eyes of faith, she herself was an helpless abomination, that she was good, but evil nonetheless. It was a warning, definitely a warning, and all I could ask myself was, what the hell is purple? I was back on my gurney, broken into a cold sweat, and as you know, on the eve of withdrawal. I shouted that I was feeling sick. I screamed to be released, so that I could go searching for dope, even inside this trembling vista of nothing. Trembling because the floor started to quake. I begged as my muscles started to burn and ache. The trembling of the floors made me nauseous. The roped figure moved to my side, and in my aid produced a diabetic syringe with murky fluid. Its face was sheeted by a black veil, pierced my arm, aspirated, and injected, patting my vein down and rubbing out the itch. It felt better, but also a lot more frightened. Suddenly the chasm began to warm. Before that, there was no temperature, and the heat only accelerated. The metal bars around the gurney scalded my arms. My skin started to melt off, and I screamed. There was no sound, maybe because the place lacked a proper conduit for it, or maybe not. Maybe torture was the point. My surroundings began to move like a mirage distortion, the way the searing heat of a working grill makes the backdrop break into a languid snake dance. A black, billowing river of smoke flooded into the corridor from ahead, and all I could do was hack and choke myself senseless. My esophagus felt like a steel, bristled brush was scrubbing and grinding away my muscles, until black blood spurted from my nostrils all up and down my hospital gown. My skin turned melted to superglue spooled around the metal like clay. The burning sensation was striking me down to the nerves. It was the most extreme pain I'd ever felt. Before I knew it, everything turned black. Claws extended from the walls and scraped away my skin, ripped apart my gown. Anguished wails exponentiated and grew closer. All I could smell and taste was creosote and ash. Embers flickered like lightning bugs and stung like hornets when they alighted to my bare, Raw skin. Is it purple yet? Echoed Bethany's word like a struck, oscillating bell, tolling some ambiguous certainty waiting to happen as I suffocated and burned. A cold blast fog vaporized most of the smoke to a narrow, floating rill, seeping from the center of the Gothic, black double doors we finally reached. At this point, I wanted to tear myself out of my own flesh and leave it smoldering on the floor. The door spread open in a slow motion, like a Goliath crab placidly spreading its wings, ready to take flight. Something indecipherable was exchanged between my assistants and another black, amorphous figure. The white figure turned and looked into my direction. It was my dad. Only his face was twisted into a terrifying rictus. His pale skin was almost green, head like a skull draped in rubber. His grin was so wide I thought it could connect at the back of his skull. His sockets were sunken and his pupils were stark black. He was laughing at me, and then he stopped, shook his head in disappointment, and turned back. He died of an overdose when I was 2. I think he was an embodiment of everything he didn't want me to be. I might have vomited. We passed and entered a large chamber. It was my living room turned upside down. I looked up and saw myself hanging unrestrained from the ceiling, seated on my couch. Nodding off with a limp tourniquet coiling my arm like a dead viper, and the syringe was pierced into the carpet. I had my fluorescent pink nightlight screwed into the lamp fixture and my beardy's nightlight turned on, imbuing the entire apartment in the shade of purple. The room turned in a pinwheel revolution until all was upright. I looked into my own eyes, my doppelganger burning into mine. He was terrified, his pupils constricted to pinpoints, and, without moving his lips, I said to myself, "This shit has to stop." I stepped off the gurney and fell to the floor. My skin was still stuck to the metal. It ripped away in uneven patches, an unintentional flaying. My arms looked like a sweater that had just scaled the bulwark of a razor wire and a barbed fence. The patches of muscles were exposed, others down to the bone. Blood ran and never stopped. All I could taste was the rust and bile, and yet, despite the agony, all I could do was rub my injection site. I remember wanting to jump into my own body and escape this nightmare, but a fraction of shadowed, clawed figures prodded me and skewered me with spiked ingots, thrusting me into the door, screeching at me, "In, you rotten! Get inside! Rotten!" Said repetitiously until I turned the handle and exited. Except I wasn't exiting anything. I was pushed into, as best as I can describe, a tiny church confessional. They struck me until I fell backwards, landing over a floor and a kneeler brandished with hot metal spikes. They cackled and shut the door. I never saw their faces. On the door was a little rectangular slat window. To the side, the latticed opening where the priest sits, except his place was a burning, Vanta black fire. You couldn't see it and just feel the waves of suffocating heat rush in a boiling tide. I heard the window slatter clatter and slide open, and the purple light surfaced the way theater lights do when the credits at the end of a movie, and all I saw were these blades jutting out of the floor, walls and ceiling. I couldn't sit, I couldn't lay down, I couldn't stand, and yet I had to do just that. I wasn't of spirit form. I was whole, solid, and lucid, except I couldn't die. The space was so crammed I could hardly stand. If I stood, they'd impale my feet. If I tried to sit, they'd pierce my legs and guts. And it started to heat. I began to bake inside of a serrated oven, and by then, I don't know if the fire or the spikes hurt worse. It was all just a sadistic amalgam of eternal anguish and hopeless despair, and as the eyes twinkled through the window, guffaws of sweeping, shrill laughter permeated my every existing cell, every atom and tangible molecule. And I knew that in this place I'd be forever, beyond the curtain call of time. Suddenly, the torture chamber started to spin with after images of the horror I was stricken to when my eyes finally flustered themselves open and I saw myself suspended cruciform underneath a group of doctors and nurses. One of those looming personnel looked me dead in the eyes and very bluntly said to me, "You're a lucky man. You need to stop this shit. Understand me?" And that was it. They said I was dead for 2 minutes and 17 seconds, but the horror I experienced slogged on much longer than that. Perhaps the lingering pain I felt was a result of the surgery. When I overdosed, I was standing up and had fallen forward, face first into my glass refectory table centerpiece in my living room, which shattered under me and nearly caused me to bleed to death. I was lucky to have left my door unlocked. My elderly neighborhood heard the crash and came in. She called 911. I know where she's going to when she dies, but me? I've relapsed since. I don't know what's to come of this person as of today, but last I saw, he was the yellow hue of jaundice, thin as a bone, and shaking in his shoes. A few years back, he was in the paper for robbing a Domino's pizza 2 days in a row. Such heedless behavior in a sacrosanct for junkies. Perhaps everything he experienced was just an unconscious manifestation of junkie guilt. God knows I've had my share. But I believe in the power of darkness, and I'm sure it's probably the best to tread that path lightly. A few days ago, I was out for a morning hike in my local forest, on a trail I had walked 100 times before. It's a 5-mile loop that passed by a creek, and it was just isolated enough to feel like a refreshing sojourn away from the suburbs, without being too remote. It was a bit of a surprise to me when I came across a fence about a mile into my walk, right across where the trail normally continued. There was a sign that said something along the lines of "Government property, no trespassing," and I sighed in annoyance. I'd been down on this very same trail nearly a week prior, and the fence and sign hadn't been there before. I almost turned around, but it was such a nice day, and the trail was so short. I figured it wouldn't be too big of a deal if I hopped the fence and finished my hike. I could find another route the next time. I didn't see a security camera or anything else like that, so I simply hopped the fence and continued my walk, annoyed that it may be the last time I would be able to hike on that trail. It's a beautiful area, and I stopped occasionally listening to the birds or smell the fresh air. After about 2 miles or so, I reached the creek and decided to sit down and enjoy the view. As I took a swig from my thermos of hot tea, listening to the gentle burbling of the nearby stream, I had almost forgotten about the fence. Out in the forest like this, I felt like I was one with the sublimity of nature. Everything was quiet, calm and serene. After a few minutes though, I began to feel a little uneasy. It took me a moment to realize why. There were no birds singing. I hadn't noticed at first because the creek was so close by that it provided its own ambient noise. But once I was aware of the birds' absence, the silence was deafening. A couple years back I had an experience with a mountain lion. It was on a different trail, but in the same general part of the state. I recall that all the birds had gone quiet, instinctively silencing themselves in the presence of the beast. It had simply come down out of the bushes, walking across the trail before looking at me curiously. Luckily, I had managed to keep my wits about me and succeeded in scaring off the cougar with a combination of yelling and flapping my jacket to make myself look bigger. As soon as it departed, the chirping of the birds returned. After that day, I always carried a small air horn with me on my hikes. I reached into my bag and pulled out the air horn, looking around cautiously in search of anything that could be scaring off the birds. I didn't see anything and was almost on the verge of simply pressing down on the air horn preemptively when I heard the snap far away on my right. Turning cautiously, I strained my eyes to see what could have caused the noise. The air horn at ready. Knowing what I do now, it's very possible that if I had chosen to use the horn, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. Though at first it blended in with the trees and brush, I noticed the deer rather quickly. I relaxed a little, exhaling in relief as I put the air horn back into my bag with shaking hands. I still felt uneasy though, even at that distance. I could tell that there was something off about the animal, and the bird still hadn't returned. Staying quiet and laying low, I grabbed my binoculars and took a closer look at the distant deer. It was a buck with a beautiful set of antlers. This already struck me as somewhat odd, as most of the bucks around here had long since shed their antlers at this point. Even odder, however, was the structure of the antlers. Rather than two large antlers with multiple points facing upwards, it seemed more like 6 to 10 spikes extending out of the skull. On further inspection, the deer was malnourished, emaciated even, with clumps of fur missing. As I watched, it hobbled feebly on unsteady legs towards the river, lowering its head to drink. My thought was that it must have been suffering from chronic wasting disease, perhaps coupled with a bit of mange. I felt sorry for the animal and with sadness continued to watch through my binoculars. Then its antlers twitched. It didn't look like they were going to fall off due to shedding or anything like that. The points moved outward slightly, like a hand unclenching from a fist. As soon as the antlers twitched, the deer stood up from its string, eyes wide, almost as if it were standing at attention. As I watched, the now clearly articulated antlers further stretched, bending until the points touched the side of the buck's head. Then they began to push. As I watched in stunned horror, something ripped itself out of the deer's skull with a disgusting crack of splintering bone. The object I previously thought to be antlers were in fact the spider-like legs of some horrible monstrosity. My hands were shaking too much to get a clear view, but it was somewhat crab-like in appearance, with a sharp mouthparts and beady black eyes. As soon as the creature pulled itself fully free from the skull, the deer's corpse fell down limply into the stream, its bright red blood polluting the fresh water. The antler thing scuttled off rapidly into the tree line, disappearing in an instant. As soon as it was out of sight, I ran as fast as I could down the trail, not stopping until I had jumped over the fence and got back into my car. When I finally arrived home, I vomited on the side of the road. I had called out of work for the next couple of days, claiming that I was feeling ill, which to be fair, I was. I have no possible idea what the thing was. All I know is that I won't be going on hikes again anytime soon. Every day I drive to the local gas station and smoke cigarettes on my lunch break. I work in assembly on a clean campus and there is no smoking on the premises. Luckily the gas station isn't far and I get to have about 20 minutes of peace, quiet and decompress. I do the same thing every time, meticulously watching the clock on the dash while my lunch break ticks away. There's a line of parallel parking styled spots on the side of the building and I pull up there, enjoying my first smoke while I watch the corn sway in the wind while the radio plays softly. The gas station is less than a mile away, but my job is located outside of town in the country, so the space between places is filled with nothing but a cornfield, trees, and a stretch of power lines running high above. It's a very peaceful rustic getaway, and I oftentimes zone out staring into the space, watching the corn sway as my eyes wander aimlessly. 3 days ago, I saw something staring back at me. I don't know how long it had been standing there before I noticed it. At first, I acknowledged it like one would notice a tree they hadn't seen before, suddenly becoming aware of an existence that didn't matter, except this tree was a humanoid in shape, and by the looks of it didn't have any skin. It was a few 100 feet away, but there was no denying the fact that something was terribly wrong with it. An icy chill immediately ran up my back, triggering all of my nerves while I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. I looked around to see if anyone else had noticed it, but everyone was just going about their business, pumping gas or hurriedly leaving their car to head inside. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, swearing it had just been a trick of the light. Not only was it still there, it had moved closer. It had drifted out of the corn slightly, leaning against the leg of the tall power line it was under. I could see the slight deviation of movement while it stood there, like it was breathing heavily and stopped to catch its breath. Even from so far away, I could see the specks of white for eyes staring at me, and an overwhelming feeling of foreboding tunneled towards me. It felt like I was going to get hit by a car, or a plane would crash on top of me. It's hard to explain. It just stood there, staring at me. As the seconds melted to minutes, I snuffed out my smoke and did what every other rational person would do. I grabbed my phone and tried to take a picture of it. It stood there while I opened the app for my camera, holding the same stare as I tried to get the camera to focus. It finally did, and I slowly zoomed to try to get a decent view of it. But just as my thumb tapped the button, it disappeared. Not like I looked away and it was gone. It just vanished into thin air, like it ceased to exist. I sat there for a time afterwards, unable to shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The longer I sat, the more I wondered if I just imagined it. Maybe the days of lack of sleep, fatigue, and stress were piling up and I was starting to daydream. Maybe I had dozed off and didn't notice. The days had felt so much shorter since daylight savings time. Maybe it was just a case of the seasonals picking away at my brain. I kept thinking of scenarios to justify such a thing, even as I pulled out of my parking spot and headed back to work. I kept looking back to see the empty spot in the corner under the power line, expecting to see it again, but I saw nothing. After I punched back in, I asked some of the people on the same line as me ones that I knew would also go and smoke during the allotted time on lunch. I wasn't the only regular there, but I was the only person that saw it. Most told me that I needed to get some sleep and stop staying up so late. Others suggested that it was just a deer, or maybe someone who lived out in the boonies trying to make themselves viral by scaring people in the corn. In the end, I laughed it off, but throughout the day, I was unable to shake the feeling stricken from what I saw. The dread continued to stay with me, even after I punched out for the day and headed home. It persisted throughout the night, and it made me paranoid when I hung out at home, and even as I crawled into bed. I tossed and turned for a while, thinking of the red humanoid shape lingering in the distance. I kept waking up and looking at the doorway, expecting to see it. Each time, nothing. But the feeling of unease persisted, even as I felt myself succumbing to sleep. That night, I dreamt of walking through the cornfield. Chilly wind tossing my hair and whipping at my clothes. The corn swayed in the gust, a steady dance that moved across the crops as far as I could see. It was peaceful but engulfing, an intimidating embrace that made me feel small in the vast expanse of it. Dried husk crackled under my feet, and the mud tried to steal my shoes. I don't know where I am, and I start to feel the swaying stalks close in on me. Above, the power line reaches towards the sky, looming over me like a sinister lighthouse. I looked away from the swirling gray overcast, following the legs of the power line. I squint through the stalks to see, and I see a dark crevice in the ground ahead. Beneath the power line, there is a cellar door hanging open, beckoning me. I wake to the sound of my alarm, drenched in sweat. A fog swirls in my head, oddly hungover from a sober sleep. I look to the doorway of my bedroom and find it empty. The sense of dread continues to loom. I get ready for work and head in, thoughts of corn and the cellar door racing through my mind. I can't shake the thought of it, and it proceeds to pester me through the beginning of my shift. I try to busy my mind and focus on work, tightening fasteners on the bracket of air compressors and running rubber hoses as the clock ticks away. Even as my hands work monotonously, I feel the weight of my eyes on me. I constantly look over my shoulder, but there is never anyone there. On my lunch break, I decided to return to the gas station. I convinced myself that I'm just being crazy and that there is no reason not to go there and enjoy my daily smokes on my break. Just the thought of them sounds so nice. I pull into my usual spot and light up, feeling the weight ease off my shoulders after the first drag. I sink into my seat, keeping my eyes closed as I ignore the cornfield next to me, telling myself over and over, there's nothing there. I gathered the courage to open them up, and I look to the cornfield. The power line stands definitely in the corn, and I feel myself sweating as I trace the length of the spire to the ground. Beneath the tall structure, there is nothing. I breathe a sigh of relief and laugh at myself, nearly coughing as I wipe the sweat from my brow. There is no skinned man, only corn swaying in the wind. I feel better having conquered the fear. I turn my music on and a familiar song crackles over heavy static. I try to tune the dial, but the distortion only grows the more I tamper with it. In the end, I turn the volume all the way down and decide I'm gonna run into the gas station and buy an energy drink. I suddenly feel parched, and the feeling of an ice-cold electric carbonation sounds too good to pass up. I shut off my car, get out the car and stop. The skinned man is standing near the gas station pumps, peeking out at me. His eyes are bright white and beady, his stare freezing me to the core. His limbs twitch and he takes a step out from behind the pump, a bloody trail smearing the pavement with his footstep. I break out of my fear and look around to see if anyone else sees him, but nobody does. It's like he's not even there. Even as he takes another step towards me, a woman in a hatchback pulls past him, nearly grazing him. His skin is completely gone. Steam radiates from the exposed bloody muscle, steady drips of red trickling down his arms and legs. He appears genderless, but his build is masculine. As the woman next to him gets out of the car and starts fueling, his mouth slowly hangs open and he starts to scream. A scream that nobody can hear but me. I get into my car and I leave, tires squealing as I turn around in the lot. I keep watching him, terrified he's going to suddenly give a chase and rip me out of my car. But he only reaches for me, slowly, like he can barely move. When I haul ass down the road, I watch for him in the rear view mirror. He lowers his hand and vanishes. Nobody believed me when I got back to work. I talked about a man with no skin and his scream that no one could hear. The reactions were less entertained than the day before. Those who didn't laugh excused themselves awkwardly, and those that did, neither. They just looked at me like I was crazy. My shift crawled for the rest of the day. I was incredibly anxious, a cold sweat dampening my forehead as I looked around cautiously. Everywhere I looked, I swore I saw the skinned man, but only to see an empty aisle or a part rack instead. People tiptoed around me or avoided me entirely, not wanting to draw attention to my increasing paranoia. I kept hearing his scream, the dry cry of an out-of-tune orchestra. Just thinking of it and seeing his mouth open made my skin crawl. Once my shift was concluded, I punched out and left work without a word. On the way home, I kept looking around, still unable to shake the feeling of someone watching. I kept feeling someone staring at me from the back seat, breathing on my neck. Each time I would turn to look, there would be nothing. Once home, I stayed for the rest of the day. I locked the doors and preoccupied my mind with TV, hopping restlessly from one streaming service to the next, in search of something to draw my attention. I would occasionally peek out of the window of my apartment to make sure he wasn't there, but only would see the occasional passing car. Everywhere I looked, I saw those damned eyes staring at me. That night I fell asleep on the couch, the muffled drone of an anime playing from the television. I don't remember when I dozed off, but I soon found my tired paranoia easing into a restless slumber. In my dream I returned to the corn. I was looking at the power line, watching it tower above me. At my feet was the open cellar, an echoing wind whispering from the dark opening in the muddy earth. Above, the sky swirls grey, and I look down just to see myself jumping in. I fall for a long time, plummeting through the darkness silently. There seems to be no end. In the darkness below, I see a faint red glow, a glimmer of light approaching me. I reach for it, hoping it would stop whatever is transpiring. As the lights drift closer, the darkness explodes with a sound of an out-of-tune orchestra. I wake up, covering my ears. The sound's brutal and deafening now that I'm awake. My apartment shakes under it, and I look around to find the source, only to end up screaming. The skinned man is on my balcony, his mouth opened wide in a silent, tortured scream. He places his hands on the glass of the slider, leaning in to see me. The feeling of primal fear swallows me, and I fight the urge to cry. Vomit churns in the confines of my stomach. As suddenly as my dream ended, the skinned man vanished, once again leaving an empty space in his wake. I spent the rest of the night cowering in my room, hiding under the blankets and flinching at every sound. I slept restlessly, plagued by the thoughts of being burned alive, my screams echoing over the field of corn. Today, I woke up to my alarms, flinching over the thought of the out-of-tune orchestra. I crawled out of my bed, slowly, my limbs aching from my restless sleep. The thought of getting ready for work fled my mind, and I thought only of the power line in the cornfield. I looked outside and saw the sky was unusually gloomy. My skin crawled with goosebumps that refused to leave, and my hair stood on end. Even in my groggy state, a feeling of being watched refused to leave. I looked everywhere for this skinned man, begging this to stop. It has to stop. I can't keep doing this. Today I got dressed and headed to work, but called off in the process. I followed the same route in my car, but instead of turning into my work site, I kept going until I found the nearby gas station. I pulled into my usual spot, shakingly inhaling a smoke as I looked at the field of corn surrounding it. The power line stood tall, almost menacingly in the dark swirl of gloom in the sky. It has to stop. It has to. I snubbed out my cigarette and exited my car, feeling the chilly wind assault me as I closed the door behind me. I thought calling the police, but I didn't know what I would tell them. Every scenario I imagined ended with me just being called crazy. My feet moved on their own, and I swallowed hard as I started walking in the direction I had viewed so many times on my lunch break. The grass faded and the corn began, and I made my way into the deafening sea of husks ahead. The stalks were loud and cracked under my feet, and the mud sucked at my shoes. I tripped and stumbled on the uneasy ground, and I grabbed the stalks in an attempt to keep myself balanced. My legs burned and the crop scratched and whipped at me. Soon I felt lost in the corn, every step closing me off from the outside world. The corn stalks were taller the more you went in, until, eventually, I felt like I was being swallowed by it. I kept my eyes on the power line above. I decided I would look there, and if I found nothing, I would turn back and go back home. Maybe then I would get some help. Just as I was getting used to the crunch of my footsteps, the ground started to even out and I found myself in a small clearing. 4 large metal posts stood on each side, posted at each corner of the clearing. I could hear the creak of metal swaying in the wind, and I felt myself shrink as I looked up. I was standing underneath the power line now, next to the leg where I had first seen the skinned man a few days ago. It was eerily quiet and cold in the clearing, moss and dead grass covering the churned mounds left behind by excavation. I felt a strong urge to run back to my car, but every time I closed my eyes, I was reminded by the same piercing stare and scream. If I went back home, I would just go back to hiding in my apartment. I looked for a disturbed dirt, for a grave, for a body. What I found was nothing but cold dirt and dried husks, with the occasional rock jutting from the earth. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I found no skinned man or signs of there ever being one. The corn swayed the circle around the clearing, and I felt foolish for wandering out here by myself. The wind picked up, and above, the power line creaked. I watched the electrical line sway in the sky, and I felt small and out of my depth. What was I hoping to find here? A skeleton laying in grass? Stupid, I thought to myself, walking all the way out here with not even as much as a shovel. My hands started to ache from the cold and I found myself shivering. There was nothing to be found here. Maybe I did need help after all. I turned around to leave, my cheeks burning with frustration. I felt my eyes water, the helpless draw of tears ready to further my own embarrassment. There is no skinned man. You're just crazy. You're fucking crazy. As I sulked back to the edge of the clearing, something caught my foot. I tripped and stumbled into the mud, looking back at whatever had a hold on me. It was heavy and cold, and it kicked up a line of dirt in its wake. It was a metal chain. I looked at it dumbfounded, the links heavily rusted and caked with dirt. I untangled my foot and held it up, and followed the source of the mysterious chain. I got back on my feet and gathered the slack, staring at it for a moment before tugging on it. The lead disappeared into the earth in front of me, directly under the power line. The chain was cold to the couch, but I wrapped it around my hands and started to pull. The earth fought against me, matted weeds and mud slinging as I ripped it from the ground. I pulled and pulled, digging my heels into the ground as I yanked it free. I caught suddenly, and I put all my weight behind it, running backwards until it suddenly broke loose. In an uproar of the breeze, I fell flat on my ass. And in front of me, a wooden door flung open. A whisper cooed from the underground, and I climbed to my feet and walked to it. It was the entrance to a dark pit, a crude ladder leading the way to an unseen destination. My mind begged to call the police, my body pleaded to go home. In the end, I did neither, and my shoes soon found the rungs of the old forgotten ladder. The light above shows a floor of damp dirt and bones, long decayed and hidden in the dark. The passage wasn't as long as I thought. It went down about 10 feet and I expected it to open up into some grand chasm below. But when the ladder came to an end, I found only a corridor, a 10 by 10 room carved deep into the earth. The light from above pulled in, cutting through the haze of dust and stagnant air. I squinted through the heavy particles in an attempt to see what the light seemed to be avoiding. Once the dust began to fade, I could hear the whispers growing, a hushed chorus that called to me from the corner of the derelict hall. The walls were etched with erratic text, words toppling words in an indecipherable message. I want to read the words, but I'm drawn away, my focus pulled to the corner where the light shines the least. In the corner is a brass chair, and sitting in it, a corpse with dozens of limbs. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't, the mummified curled hands demanding my attention. It looked like a human, its skeletal frame filling the entirety of the throne-like seat. Empty eyes and hanging mouth, its extra bony arms fanning out like wings. A gaping hole sits in the center of its chest, like something had been ripped out of it. Impossibly proportioned and long dead, the being dedicated several appendages to the object it held in its lap. A glass orb, radiating the slightest shimmer of red. The whispers were coming from it. I remember being unable to lift my eyes from the orb. It drew me in, its whispers beckoning me to the dying glow it held within. The corpse stayed frozen in place, its decayed frame getting larger the closer I got. It wanted me to take the orb. It was offering it to me. I reached out and touched it, a static aura tickling my fingers as they draw near the glass. I wanted the orb. I needed to hold it. Nothing else seemed to matter. My fingers hovered around the glass in anticipation, and a strange heat billowed from it as I prepared to lift it. I looked into the corpse's eyes, twin skeletal voids that watched from its petrified husk. Just as I grabbed the orb, the corpse's jaw clacked. The orb exploded with red light, and with it, an unimaginable heat. The red glow consumed me like a raging fire, engulfing me until it covered my entire body. I tried to swipe it off me, but it started to burn, a wicked chemical boil that seeped into my arms and leg like acid. I watched in horror as my skin started to part with me, bubbling and oozing until I was left with nothing but bloody meat. It collected and twisting in front of me like paint, a writhing mass that slipped through my fingers when I tried to grab at it. My strength began to fade, and my legs no longer felt capable of holding me. I collapsed helplessly to the ground, glaring at the orb in betrayal as it shined bright and decadent. My muscles felt the pain of every speck of dirt, every piece of gravel that scraped mercilessly into my exposed flesh. The pain was unbearable, a never-ending scream across my entire body. The mass of skin contorted and flexed, stretching across the corpse and its many limbs. It webbed between every finger and over every dried tendon, new life taking shape and cracking as it coated over the nightmarish husk. The arms, so many arms, assisted in the new fitting, pulling and tugging until the garb was complete. I could only reach out in my misery while it repaired itself, the horrible form worsening the longer I watched it mold. Joints popped into life, thin eyelids blinked. Once the form was complete, the gaping chest cavity quivered in agitation. Before my unclosable eyes, the being picked up the orb with its many hands and buried it into its chest. The cavity sealed on its own, tendrils of thick skin stitching itself until the red glow was no more. While I lay helpless on the cold, painful dirt, the being rose from the chair, standing and stretching tall before hunching over on its multiple limbs. It looks at me for a moment, an emotionless clacking echoing in the chamber before it makes its way to the ladder and climbs it like a spider. The last I see of the monstrosity is its appendages slinking into the light, right before the door slams shut behind it. I've been in this darkness ever since. I don't know how long I've been down here. Hours, days, weeks. All I know is that my constant suffering and inability to escape it. Despite my exposed body, I am immune to the cold, immune to the prospect of perishing. That's not the only change. Since discovering the corpse, I can feel an extension of myself, an ethereal tether that lets me move beyond my miserable form on this cold earth. Some kind of drift between time and space. I don't know if it's an after effect of the orb itself, or my fractured sanity in this tomb I found myself in. I can do other small things, like move grains of dirt or sway the air in one way or another. In an attempt to recollect some of my sanity, I have inscribed my story in the walls of this grave, but the longer the time goes on, the foggier the memories seem to get. I don't understand it. I can only hope what I think is transpiring is real and not a fabrication of my delusional misery. I can't go far, but each time I find I can get a little further. I can see the cornfield above my tomb. I can almost feel the air dancing across it. If I focus hard enough, I can see myself. I don't know why they are there, or if it's even real, but if I try hard enough, maybe I could reach them. I need to warn them and tell them to stay away from here. I need to warn them of the monster I set free. I don't know what it wants or why it was down here, but I fear for the life I left behind above the ground. Maybe someone can stop it. Maybe I can stop it. In my shattered mind, I remember where I used to work, where I used to live. If I can find them at the right time, maybe I can warn them. Maybe I can save them from a demise such as this. Thank you for listening. If you like this video, please like and subscribe so that you can hear more of me. And if you didn't like this video, there isn't much I can tell you. Until then.